Convicted child killer Kyle Bevan was murdered inside HMP Wakefield earlier this week. Fellow prisoners, the Iceman Mark Fellows, aged 45, 56-year-old Lee Newell and 63-year-old David Taylor, have all been arrested on suspicion of his murder. Now, Mark Fellows and Lee Newell are only 2 of 70 prisoners in the UK who are currently serving whole-life tariffs. Many people will have heard of the Iceman Mark Fellows for his involvement in the murders of both prominent gangsters Paul Massey from Manchester and John Kinsella of Liverpool. In this video, I'll be providing some background concerning this incident at HMP Wakefield, after which I'll be sharing some information concerning this second individual, Lee Newell, who is actually serving time for killing another prisoner at Long Lartin Prison back in 2013. Take a listen to the following. A number of prisoners have been charged with the murder of a convicted child killer in a high-security West Yorkshire prison. Kyle Bevan, 33, was found dead in his cell in HMP Wakefield on Wednesday morning. He was 2.5 years into a minimum sentence of 28 years for murdering his partner's 2-year-old daughter Lola James in the family home in Haverfordwest, Pembrokeshire in 2020. Wakefield is a Category A prison, one of 10 in the UK with the highest security in place. West Yorkshire Police said they were called to the prison at 8:25 a.m. on Wednesday after receiving reports that a man had been found dead in his cell. Mark Fellows, 45, Lee Newell, 56, and David Taylor, 63, have all been charged with Bevan's murder. The men appeared at Leeds Magistrates Court on Friday by video link. They were remanded into custody and are due to appear again at Leeds Crown Court on Monday. Each defendant wore a grey tracksuit, and Fellows and Newell spoke only to confirm their names, dates of birth, and that they understood what had taken place. Taylor was asked if he understood and replied, "Absolutely not. I'm innocent." Now, rumours have been circulating since Wednesday suggesting that Kyle Bevan wasn't actually killed on Wednesday, but was actually killed on Tuesday night, placed back into bed as if he was asleep, and then only discovered the following morning when police checked his cell. But of course, at this stage, that remains pure speculation. Now, regarding these individuals, many people will know the name Mark Fellows for being the gunman who killed both John Kinsella and Paul Massey. However, I did uncover some interesting information regarding this other individual, Lee Newell. Now, Lee Newell was originally sent to prison back in 1988 for murdering his neighbour, Mary Neal, when living in Norwich. Then, in 2013, during time spent in Long Lartin Prison, he and Gary Smith took the life of child killer Subhan Anwar, an individual who was serving life for the murder of his girlfriend's 2-year-old daughter. So if Lee Newell turns out to be guilty concerning the murder of Kyle Bevan, this will actually be the second child killer that Lee Newell has murdered since being in custody. Now, what I want to do next is take you through the judge's sentencing remarks concerning the trial of Kyle Bevan. Now, do be forewarned, some of the following information is very sensitive, but it does provide a great deal of context concerning the background to Kyle Bevan's crimes.
Lola James was described by her grandmother as a character who loved life. Her father said she was always smiling and happy, a little ray of sunshine, with a laugh which would fill the room with pure joy. Her photograph reminds us of a beautiful little girl. But you, Kyle Bevan, murdered her when she was only 2 years old, and you, Sinead James, allowed her death. In 2020, Sinead James lived as a single mother in Haverfordwest with her 3 daughters, a baby born in May 2019, Lola born in September 2017, and her older sister born in March 2014. Kyle Bevan was not the father of any of these children, but very soon after he met Sinead James in February 2020, he was sleeping in her house every night, and when lockdown started in March 2020, it was his home. I'm sure from the evidence at trial that Kyle was responsible for multiple assaults on the children before he murdered Lola. Whilst the evidence of some in isolation would have been inconclusive, taken together, it is compelling. A 2 a.m. text on the 19th of April 2020 shows that one of the girls had smashed her face, which Kyle blamed on the stairs. On the 26th of April, Sinead James noticed a mark under Lola's mouth. Kyle blamed it on her falling down. A text at 1:35 a.m. on the 4th of May shows that Lola was screaming when Kyle was with her. The next day, he told Sinead James that Lola dropped to the floor and bit her lip. The text record shows that Sinead saw Lola spitting at Kyle and making what he described as a horrible noise at him. I have no doubt that this was because Lola was protesting, as a child who could not yet speak, the abuse she had suffered. A few days later, Sinead James's cousin pointed out the dirty and messy state of the house and warned her social services might get involved. Kyle was angry and aggressive about that suggestion. On the 8th of June 2020, Sinead James lied to her health visitor on the telephone that she had a female person sleeping in her house, covering up that it was actually Kyle Bevan. On the 11th of June, Sinead texted, "I'm done," and "I'm finished with Kyle." He had grabbed her arm during an argument. She texted, "I'm not putting up with it. I have the kids to think about." But she let it pass, and he carried on living in the house with the children and was often left in sole charge of them. On the 5th of July, Sinead and Kyle argued, and she told him to get out. She texted him, "What you are doing is a form of domestic violence. I know, I've been through it." He refused to leave the house, and she took it no further. On the 7th of July 2020, Kyle Bevan pushed the pram into a busy road with the baby in it. On the 9th of July, the grandmother of Kyle's own daughter messaged Sinead James that he had been abusive to his ex-partner and their daughter, and expressed concern that he was around Sinead James's children. Sinead asked Kyle's mother about it, who said it was not true. She made no other inquiry and took no steps to withdraw or protect her children from Kyle. On the same day, Lola suffered a nose injury, and Sinead wondered if it was broken. Kyle told her Lola had fallen accidentally onto a coffee table. He blamed the dog. At the same time, 2 witnesses noticed marks on either side of Lola's neck, which suggested she had been grabbed or pinned. The witness, Elivire Morgan, had a look and told Sinead and Kyle she should be taken to the doctor. But Sinead lied and said that had already been done. In fact, all that had happened, according to her evidence at trial, was that she had been told by Kyle that his mother was a nurse, which was not true, although she was a healthcare assistant, and that she had looked at Lola's injured nose in a video call. Lola was not taken to a hospital or to a doctor or examined in person by a nurse or any qualified person. Her nose was left to heal in its own way. The very next day, on the 10th of July, when Kyle was alone with the baby, Sinead texted him, "You don't need to tell me what you're doing with them. I do trust you with them." On the 11th of July, texts show that there was some sort of incident when Lola was in Kyle's care, but Sinead texted him, "Don't feel bad." I am sure that by the time of the murder, Sinead knew that Kyle was not to be trusted. On the 16th of July, the day before Lola was beaten into a coma, she asked him for his date of birth so she could do a Clare's Law or domestic violence disclosure scheme check on him. He refused to give it to her. She realised that was suspicious, but she did not press it. That night, the night of the 16th to 17th of July, Sinead James was woken at midnight by a bang, followed by Lola screaming. She got up and saw Kyle Bevan holding Lola by her bed, but when he said, "I've got this," she just went away. She did not go into Lola's bedroom or have a proper look at what had happened. She went back to her own bed and left Lola alone with Kyle while she slept. During that night, he carried out the further attacks on Lola, which killed her. By 4:26 a.m., Kyle had Lola downstairs and was photographing injuries he had inflicted on her back. By 6:30 a.m., he had inflicted a total of over 100 visible injuries all over her body. Some of them were caused by a weapon, although the weapon used was not recovered or identified. They included injuries to Lola's right thigh with circular elements in a linear pattern caused by a weapon, and bleeding puncture wounds to her forehead, also caused by a weapon. Kyle Bevan hit the side of Lola's head with such force that it caused ear bruising and subdural bleeding in her skull on that side. He shook her head backwards and forwards so violently that she lost consciousness and died from brain damage. Dr. Michelle Jardine is a consultant in paediatric intensive care who has worked in Wales for 12 years and before that at Great Ormond Street and at the Royal Brompton Hospital. She saw Lola's body in intensive care and gave evidence that it was one of the most extensively bruised and battered bodies she had ever seen. At 6:30 a.m., Kyle Bevan searched on Google, "My 2-year-old has just taken a bang to the head and gone all limp and snoring. What's wrong?" The results told him to get emergency help at once. Had he done that, Lola would have had a better chance of survival. But he didn't. He didn't get emergency help. He didn't wake Lola's mother. Instead, he tried to cover his tracks. He cleaned up Lola's vomit and blood in the bath. He cleaned the bath. He cleaned the floors. He scrubbed the body itself all over so strongly, despite the child already being injured and unconscious, that temporary transfer tattoos on her arms were removed without trace. He put clean clothing on her. He dreamt up a cover story that all Lola's injuries were attributable to a fall down the stairs after a push from the dog. He moved Lola's body around, callously photographing it and even filming it at one stage. Half an hour after the Google search, his mother woke up and saw texts he had been sending her. She immediately texted back that he must wake Sinead James up and get Lola to accident and emergency. It was 6:56 a.m. Even then, he did not wake up Lola's mother or call emergency services. He was too concerned about covering up the crime scene to do anything at all for the child. It was only half an hour after that, at about 7:27 a.m., that he finally woke Sinead James, and not having called an ambulance himself, told his mother to do it. Ambulances were then called by his mother and by Sinead James and were on the scene immediately. When the police came later in the morning at about 11 a.m., he delayed opening the front door. When they did get in, he was still vacuum cleaning away as much forensic evidence as he could. There is only one sentence for murder, and that is imprisonment for life. I must also set the minimum term that Kyle Bevan must serve before he can even be considered for release on licence by the parole board. It is possible he will never be released, as that will happen only if and when the parole board is satisfied that detention is no longer necessary for the protection of the public. That is why it is called a minimum term. Even if he is released, he will remain on licence and be subject to recall to prison for the rest of his life. The minimum term is not his sentence. His sentence is life imprisonment. Paying due regard to Schedule 21 of the Sentencing Act and reflecting the particular circumstances of the case, I am adopting 15 years as the starting point for consideration of the minimum term, but there are aggravating features which must very significantly increase it. Lola was a very young child, 2 years and 10 months old. She was particularly vulnerable, not being strong enough to resist or old enough to tell anyone what was happening. Kyle Bevan was in a position of trust, having assumed the role, as he described himself to the ambulance crew, of Lola's stepfather. He started to hurt Lola at midnight, and he carried on until she was unconscious at 6:30 a.m. He did not stop when Sinead James nearly caught him in the act when she heard Lola scream at midnight. This was a sustained, deliberate, and very violent attack. The attack was completely unprovoked. There is no suggestion that Lola was playing up in any way before she was killed. For some of the injuries, Kyle Bevan used weapons. The attack would have caused both mental and physical pain and suffering before the onset of coma. It was the culmination of several months of physical child abuse. Although I have decided that this is not a case within paragraph 22b of Schedule 21, I am sure that Kyle Bevan did this as an exercise of power, an assertion of superiority over the only person he could feel superior to, a helpless child. Afterwards, he covered up what he had done by removing or replacing the weapons and cleaning up the body and the crime scene before getting help. He ignored advice from his mother about getting immediate help. As soon as the police were involved, he tried to rehearse his partner in a false account which he had concocted, stressing to her, "You got to get it bang on like." He has no remorse at all, even now. At the time, he did not even simulate sadness about Lola's injuries and critical condition when everyone around him was distraught. At the hospital, he threatened and insulted the staff. He hurled abuse at the victim's natural father and challenged him to a fight for no reason at all, as Lola lay dying in critical care. He was openly concerned only about himself. The serious and numerous aggravating features raised the appropriate minimum term far above the starting point of 15 years. I now turn to mitigating or potentially mitigating factors. There is very little. Kyle Bevan did not specifically intend to kill, but he was completely reckless of the danger to Lola's life. The violence he inflicted all over her body, including the severe and fatal attacks on her head, both by way of blunt force and violent shaking, were a threat to the life of such a young child, which must have been obvious to him. He has been described by his own mother as thick and was diagnosed with ADHD as a child. I am satisfied that these points do not reduce Kyle Bevan's culpability. He was 28 years old and perhaps immature, but he knew exactly what he was doing. He had no previous convictions for violence, but he had been causing visible injuries to the children on the sly for a number of months. This murder was the worst thing he had done, but it was not out of character. This is a very serious case in which the balance of features I've identified moves the appropriate minimum term a long way up from the 15-year starting point. I now turn to Sinead James' conviction for allowing the death of a child. Her relationship with Lola's biological father had been brief, and he was a loving and attentive parent to Lola from a distance. However, she came into the relationship with Kyle Bevan as a victim of past domestic abuse from other partners. As a result, she had been trained through domestic abuse programs to protect herself and her children. But she allowed Kyle Bevan into her household on the basis of a superficial initial impression. As evidence against him began to mount, she continued to hope for the best and leave her children at risk. She was surrounded by supportive friends and family. She was connected with social services. She always had places of refuge, but she shut her eyes to the very obvious danger which Kyle Bevan posed to her children, even after she saw him deliberately push the pram into oncoming traffic. She decided to accept and manage the risk to herself, and more importantly, her helpless children, because he was not as bad as her previous abusers, and she liked having him there. She prioritized the relationship with Kyle Bevan over concern for her children. This was never more evident than when she went back to bed after the scream and the bang which she heard from Lola's bedroom when Lola was with Kyle, only hours before Lola was murdered. I will apply the sentencing guideline for allowing a child to die. The harm is death, and therefore Category 1. Culpability includes failing to protect Lola from a murder which involved the use of very significant force. All 4 quadrants of both Lola's eyes were bleeding at multiple levels. There was a retinal fold and retinal splitting. There was optic nerve sheath bleeding to both eyes. These are all signs of very severe force. Lola had widespread petechiae. She had subdural bleeding, mainly over the left cerebral hemisphere, but also at the back of the right cerebral hemisphere and also at the base of her brain. This was due both to very forceful shaking and significant impact injury to the left, which also caused bruising to her left ear. Further evidence of impact was the soft tissue scalp swelling at several sites over Lola's skull. The chronology shows that Sinead James was made aware of multiple injuries to her children, leaving visible marks, and also a threat to the life of the baby in her pram, which Sinead knew was Carl Bevan's fault. She knew he had taken a hammer to the light switch, was subject to mood swings, and was prone to take recreational drugs which had a bad effect on him, specifically Xanax in combination with alcohol. She showed herself willing and able to remove her children to a place of safety and to demand that Carl Bevan should leave the house. But she always brought the children back and kept leaving them in his sole care. When her children were injured, she did not take them to a doctor or to hospital, and she did not involve the police when Kyle was violent. She did not disclose the presence of Kyle or the injuries to her children to social services, although they were in active contact with her. So she failed to take any effective steps to protect Lola, including those which she had proved she was capable of. Stand up, Carl Bevan. For the murder of Lola James, I sentence you to imprisonment for life with a minimum term of 28 years, less 368 days already spent in custody on remand. You may go down.
Okay, so now let's take a deeper look into one of the other men arrested on suspicion of Carl Bevan's murder inside HMP Wakefield earlier this week. This individual is the Iceman, Mark Fellows. Now, the following interview with Detective Inspector Mark Baker provides a really good insight into Mark Fellows, the individual, his crimes, and also his eventual conviction at trial. The following interview discusses the murders of both Paul Massey and John Kinsella. Take a listen to the following.
It's been a fascinating trial to cover for me personally, working at the Liverpool Echo. Began back in November last year, concluded this week with guilty verdicts, which will see, as I say, the two men jailed for life. You were the investigating officer. Can you tell us a little bit about your role in the case now you first came to be involved in these events?
Yes, good afternoon to you. Saturday the 5th of May 2018, only a matter of months ago really, Merseyside Police were contacted about 10 to 7 in the morning. Month of May was really, really hot, if you recall. Report of a shooting, firearms discharge, just off junction 7 of the M62 in Rainhill Stoops. Obviously our emergency services, including the police and ambulance, attended and found John Kinsella dead on a pathway that ran parallel to the M62 slipway back towards Merseyside. An horrendous incident from a senior investigating officer point of view. Really, really difficult. Mark Tivendale, a retiring DCI, was actually the original investigating officer, senior officer. In fact, it was his last weekend working. He attended the scene. I picked it up that night. We had another murder that weekend, which gives you some indication of how busy we've been. So John Kinsella, just a horrendous incident really from the start. Committed in front of his partner first thing in the morning. He was out walking his 6 dogs. Very few people around. Remember the first time I attended the scene, I just thought this is going to be a very difficult investigation. We were in the middle of a field. It was baking hot. And didn't appear to be a great deal of CCTV. Didn't appear to be a great deal of witnesses. Wendy Owen, John's partner, gave us an excellent interview from the start. She gave a very, very good description of the man responsible. What she told us, she said that we were out walking with the dogs. They were off the leads. She'd crossed from her home address across the roundabout down towards the slip road, gone through what they call the piggy style locally, when she was approached by this lone gunman. In fact, she described that she thought he was going to complain because the dogs were off the lead, when suddenly she described what she heard, 2 puffs. Obviously, they were 2 shots that were fired at John. which took him straight to the floor. One we now know went through his spinal cord, and he was laid flat on the floor. The gunman then turned, shot his gun twice at Wendy. She must have been absolutely petrified, ran off. She climbed over the fencing, which took her straight into the slip road on the M62. And the dogs ran off as well. As she turned, she saw the gunman stand at close range and shoot twice into the back of John's head. That photograph is probably one of the most harrowing pictures I've ever seen as a senior investigating officer. And the investigation started from there. Wendy gave us a really, really good description of what the offender looked like. She described the clothing that he was wearing, particularly the yellow high visibility jacket and the black pants, cargo pants she described them as, and the black mountain bike. Now, from the start, we set a strategy in place around a CCTV trawl around the roundabout, looking to see which route the offender could have gone from. We quickly established that he travelled up Warrington Road out towards St Helens, back towards Warrington. We had footage of him coming and going, and we believed that that was our offender quite quickly. We then set about a really good strategy around chasing CCTV. In fact, it was that relentless pursuit of the evidence quickly that has been quite a significant factor in this case. We realised that on Jubit's Lane, which is the first left turning on Warrington Road, there were what appeared to be a coming together between a Renault Clio vehicle, the registration of which was come out in court, which was BT06 HRC, and the gunman. And we knew full well at that stage that the two were linked. What we subsequently found out was that the registration number plate on the Renault Clio had been changed. The 6 had been converted to an 8 with black insulation tape. We quickly spoke to Greater Manchester Police, Carl Jones, Detective Chief Inspector, who led the Paul Massey investigation, and his deputy, Tom Kelly, came to visit me in Merseyside and gave us a briefing in relation to the circumstances around the Paul Massey murder.
Was that because you knew that Paul Massey and John Kinsella were friends and therefore that these investigations may have been linked?
No, not at that stage. Greater Manchester Police were aware of the circumstances and felt there was a similarity between the two murders. They obviously knew that they were of their relationship because John Kinsella had attended Paul Massey's funeral. So they were quicker onto it than probably we were in relation to that relationship.
It's a good example of collaborative working between the two forces there.
Well, and that's a key message really that we obviously would like to drive home, that, you know, if you're involved in serious organised crime, collectively we will pursue dangerous people and bring them to justice. But you're right, we did work fantastically well between Greater Manchester Police and Merseyside Police, and also the Crown Prosecution Service as well, who were very, very good. So just going back to the CCTV collection, really, it was that pursuit of the evidence around the route that was taken. We subsequently found out that Mark Fellows lived near to Junction 8 on the M62, which is further up. And what we were able to do was track his route back from Rain Hill, Junction 7, back to his home address, which was complicated because he turned through Sutton Manor Woodland, which was the old colliery, the old dream site on the M62, right through there. And we deployed detectives on pedal cycles to recycle the route. And through some good old-fashioned policing, they were able to identify CCTV from addresses where the offender had come out, Mark Fellows had cycled out.
Because when he went into the woods, he changed his clothing in an attempt to disguise himself. He changed out of all black clothing into the high-vis jacket that you've described. And also his bike, a mountain bike, had been disguised with a luminous yellow markings covered by black tape. So it was important that you were able to establish that he owned a bike of that type. Again, I understand through sort of old-fashioned policing of going into shops and finding receipts and finding CCTV footage of him buying a bike of that description, of him buying a bike helmet that matched the one worn by the killer.
That's right. And that was a complicating feature around the investigation. What we saw on the day of the murder, on the 5th of May, Mark Fellows cycled out in black clothing as he's described. We had some good CCTV of him doing that. And then we knew that he changed his appearance not far from his home address, actually, because of the way we traced him on CCTV into this high-vis jacket. And he did that on a number of occasions as well. He did it on the 29th of April and a couple of days before on the 27th as well. Like you say, good old-fashioned police work. When Mark Fellows was arrested on the 30th of May, we searched his home address in Warrington. So Cheshire Police have also helped during the course of this investigation. We've received fantastic support from them. We recovered a bike that he'd subsequently purchased after the murder. We made some inquiries back at the bike shop where he'd purchased that bike. And sure enough, we identified the salesperson who said that he'd recognised him buying the GT mountain bike that he'd used during the murder. In fact, he'd actually asked him, "Where's the GT bike?" And he replied, "It's gone." And we now know the reason it'd gone is because he didn't want the police to find it because it'd been used during the commission of the murder. But like you've said previously, what complicated the investigation was he'd invested the time to actually tape up the mainstay frame of the bike to remove the high fluorescent painted colour of GT, which made it difficult to assess that was one of the same. And I would have to say that was some fantastic detective work, really, to convince us and the Crown Prosecution Service, the senior officers from the start, that it was one of the same, that the Mark Fellows had changed his appearance. Because one of the complicating features around CCTV is sometimes when you look at the footage, you can blow it up and you can make somebody look bigger than they actually are. And that happened on this particular occasion. It was only when we went back and reviewed the CCTV footage and we looked at, we did a lot of work with the manufacturers of the bike and some real specialists in relation to actually, as you saw during the course of the trial, nailing on that it was one of the same bikes. Now, after the murder, Mark Fellows developed a puncture. And it was then really that we knew that he was the gunman because he'd made that deliberate attempt to cycle back. I actually cycled the route myself one day, which was, it takes some doing. It's a long way from...
he was a very fit man, wasn't he?
He was a fit man, and we saw through the trial that he'd cycled 10K, he ran the 10K in Greater Manchester 10K, and the watch that he subsequently wore, the Garmin watch, was worn during that race. Obviously, we recovered that when he was arrested on the 30th of May, and that piece of evidence proved crucial, really, to his conviction around the Paul Massey case, because when we had it downloaded, what we saw was that he'd conducted a reconnaissance mission. He'd been out and ran the route, which assisted in the successful prosecution around him. Undoubtedly, that was key evidence, a real breakthrough moment during the course of the case.
Yeah. A few months before the murder of Paul Massey, he travelled on April 29th, 2015 by bike and by foot to a field opposite Paul Massey's home. And that's what the GPS watch revealed, that journey, and that he spent 7 or 8 minutes hanging around behind this church opposite where later the gunman would emerge with a submachine gun and kill Paul Massey as he returned home, stepped out of his car. I think what was so fascinating about the CCTV evidence and the modern policing in this case is that a lot of this evidence was circumstantial evidence, wasn't it? There wasn't, you didn't, as you said, you didn't have direct witnesses to say Mark Fellows was the gunman. You didn't have the gun to hand. There wasn't evidence in that respect. But because of the hours upon hours, I can only imagine hundreds of hours spent analysing all of this CCTV footage, and also mobile phone cell site evidence and automatic number plate recognition technology, Mark Fellows was he had no choice when it came to the trial but to admit that, yes, that was him in Rain Hill on the days in question. And soon after, his accomplice, Stephen Boyle, was also forced to concede that it was him too in Rain Hill. And that's a result of the painstaking work that you'd put in, which meant they then had to give explanations for why they were there on all these dates leading up to the murder.
I'm delighted that you said that. Well, we feel the same. That was the case. We did spend hours and hours viewing CCTV. We collected nearly 400 items of CCTV from various private addresses, including public places as well. Some people are reluctant to provide CCTV. A serious organised crime investigation, particularly a well-planned murder like this, and it was, is difficult to investigate. It was a very modern investigation. We saw through the course of the case not just the CCTV, but we also saw use of encrypted mobile telephones, which, again, we had a an officer from the Metropolitan Police come up and talked to us and gave evidence about the implication for the use of the Aquarius phone, which criminals use today. In fact, Stephen Boyle talked at great length when he was giving evidence about his use of the device and where you can purchase them from, and the fact that they're not available from the car phone warehouse or to ordinary members of the public.
And this is a £3,000 telephone that stops people from being able to know what sort of communications you've been making to each other.
There's an encrypted application on it, EncroChat, and obviously if we were communicating, it would be done in private, and obviously it's difficult for law enforcement at the moment to unpick that. Now, clearly, if it had been WhatsApp or messages or normal communication that people not involved in crime use, then it would have been much easier, and probably we would have been able to see the nature of the communication. Looking back on the trial, Stephen Boyle spoke about him being involved in crime through his life, and in fact, he said he was there to collect some money. It was part of the drugs. He was involved in drug dealing. Now, if he'd given us the passwords to his phone, then probably we could have interrogated his phone and substantiated what he told the police. But again, he only chose to tell us that during the course of the trial. When he was interviewed, he didn't mention that earlier.
Yeah, I mean, during the course of the trial, he obviously brought forward an account that nobody was expecting, least of all his co-defendant fellows. He decided to tell the jury that he'd been duped by his longtime friend and criminal associate, who for many years he'd committed armed robberies with, who for many years he was someone he trusted highly. He suggested that fellows sprung on him the gun after the shooting, that he thought he was going to collect his drugs money, and at this meeting in Sutton Manor, when the bike pulled up alongside the Renault Clio, that this handgun, this Webley revolver that was used to kill John Kinsella, was passed through the window, and that Mark Fellows had cycled away. He told the jury that he didn't want to have the gun in his car, and he decided that he had to abandon the car and get a lift back home to Rochdale with family. He actually left the car in a street in Tasso Heath, where it was recovered by police some 10 days later, I believe. And that must have been a major breakthrough in the case, because the car revealed a number of things. There was a petrol canister inside. The car, when it was discovered by police, was locked. And that revealed a big inconsistency in his account that he told to the jury, because he told jurors that he telephoned Fellows after abandoning the car and told him that he'd left the car unlocked so he could collect the gun for him. Now, that couldn't possibly have been true, because the only way the car could be locked is with the key or a fob. That must have been a big moment for you when you recovered the car, and it meant that you could then track him all the way back to his home and cite him on all these occasions travelling to Rain Hill.
It was, yes. Yeah, it was on the 15th of May, so it was 10 days later. It was in First Street in St Helens. We were absolutely delighted to recover the car. And we did wonder from the start why it'd been left where it had been. We always felt that Stephen Boyle's role was to collect the firearm. And like you've just said, during the trial, when he had made that admission, that was quite an interesting moment. In fact, it was a real significant moment during the trial. In fact, if you recall, lots of members of the public gallery gasped when he made that admission. So at that point, he'd grasped on his mate, a lifelong friend. I think they've described as brothers in arms during the course of the trial. But going back to the car, the Renault Clio, that was really interesting for us when we recovered that. Clearly, we did some forensic work around it. We were able to put Stephen Boyle to that car, which was important. Obviously, from CCTV around his home address, we saw him walking towards the car on the morning in question. He was wearing quite a distinctive scarf, if you recall, which when we executed some warrants on a strike day on the 30th of May, we recovered a scarf that had been thrown at bins at the rear of the house. Now, you'd ask yourself, well, why did he dispose of that scarf? Now, we would say from an investigation point of view, the reason he disposed of it was because it'd been used potentially to transfer the firearm. And that was real significant evidence. So he'd driven a distance of nearly 30 miles from Haywood in Manchester, and Mark Fellows had cycled a distance of 8 miles. At ridiculous times in the morning to get there before 7 o'clock. As you know before, as you said earlier, on the 29th of April, there was what we would describe as an aborted attempt. And the reason we say that is because we know that they got there just too late. We saw from CCTV Wendy Owen and John Kinsella and the dogs walking back home and they'd missed their opportunity to kill him that day. And we had a meeting on School Lane immediately after. Now, we would say, from a prosecution point of view, that they were debriefing what had gone wrong. And that was a really interesting day for us, the 29th of April. And the reason we say that was because Mark Fellows was wearing quite a distinctive helmet. It was a helmet that was purchased from Halfords. And again, going back to good old-fashioned policing, we did some work around Halfords, a brand particular helmet that had been purchased. And we found that he bought it on the 18th of April, only a few days before, and he paid £20 cash. And again, that was all captured on CCTV. And that was quite a significant moment, really, for the investigation. We then knew that it was him. And obviously we started planning then for the arrest phase, which is really important. I know we've talked about the investigation team that have worked at the Major Crime Unit, the new Operational Command Centre in Speke, but this really was a one-team approach to the investigation. There's lots of support functions that have worked really hard, particularly around a modern investigation, as you've described before. Digital forensic unit based there at the Operational Command Centre, downloading phones. We've got CCTV units at headquarters. They were absolutely fantastic in gathering the footage that we needed. When you're chasing CCTV, it's difficult because you've only got a very short window of opportunity to get it, because as you know, a lot of CCTV systems overwrite it after a period of time. Sometimes it's up to 7 days. So it was that relentless pursuit of the collection of the CCTV that was vital to us. So rather than come back when we collected CCTV, the investigation was conducted out in St Helens, Warrington, Rainhill, just chasing around the community and trying to negate that the gunman may well have gone somewhere else. From an investigation point of view, it's not just about chasing the evidence, it's also about negating the fact that it could have been somebody else. And I think during the course of the trial, you saw that we traced a number of witnesses that were out walking dogs on the day in question. And in effect, what we did was rule out any possibility of the gunman being anybody other than Mark Fellows. And we worked really hard, really, to bring these witnesses to court. And it's hard bringing witnesses to court around serious organised crime because people are fearful. And I think from a detective point of view, we're really proud of the work we did in encouraging people to come and give their evidence.
Yeah. When did you first centre on Mark Fellows as being your prime suspect? When did his name first come into the investigation, and how did that happen?
It came when Greater Manchester Police came to see us. Carl Jones felt straight away there was strong similarities between the two investigations. Paul Massey was a significant figure in Salford, and he knew that the gunman had waited for some time. We felt our gunman had waited for some time. We knew that from Wendy he'd cycled. Carl Jones had told me that his gunman had waited for a long time and he'd either cycled or ran away. So we were looking for similarities between the two. We feel, and I think the sentence reflects that, there's very few people that kill in the manner at which he did. So because of that, I had an open mind that it would be Mark Fellows, but I needed to see it from an evidential point of view. So although we were aware of him and we knew where he lived, we had to chase the evidence to support the case really against him. So although we had a working hypothesis, filling those gaps is what we set about doing, and really strongly supported by Greater Manchester Police. Going back to talking about CCTV evidence, they have what they call a Vera unit, which again played out well in court. And they gathered a lot of the CCTV unit from around Greater Manchester, around Haywood, but assisted in presenting it in court, because that's really, really important that we do that in the best format for a jury to understand. And as you saw, it came across well. And that was important for us, really.
I mean, the shooting of John Kinsella's on May 5th, the arrests take place on May 30th. Fellows was arrested on board a flight returning from Amsterdam at Manchester Airport. Boyle was arrested 2 days later. He was hiding out in a hotel in Bolton under a false name. And obviously at the time you said you searched both of their houses. At what point between May 5th and May 30th were you really confident that you'd got your men and that these were the people that had committed this offence?
I think probably quite quickly. Once we realised that the evidence was being gathered around the involvement of certainly Mark Fellows, and once we saw the links back to Stephen Boyle and the Clio, and where he'd come from. We felt we was building a case. I think probably the crucial moment was when we saw that Mark Fellows had purchased a helmet on the 18th of April from Halfords. Was a turning point. And people have said we were lucky around the evidence. We would say that the harder we worked, the luckier we got, because it was just that relentless pursuit of evidence, and we tried not to put off till tomorrow what we could do today. And when we seized opportunities, we saw other opportunities unfolding for us as well. The bike, obviously contacting the salesperson around that was a real significant moment for us. The recovery of the Garmin watch, just hard work really, and looking at the detail around the CCTV, you can't underestimate how difficult that can be, the concentration required and what you're looking for. We saw through the course of the trial that Stephen Boyle actually attended on a motorbike on the 27th of April and met up with Mark Fellows then. In fact, John Kinsella walked past walking his dogs, and we now know that was another reconnaissance mission. And they were missing from CCTV for some time. Now, as you saw during the trial, that played out that they spent a long time planning where they were going to kill him.
They spent 2 hours near a motorway roundabout, and Boyle told the jury that they were socialising. As the prosecutors pointed out, it's a strange place to socialise for 2 hours at a motorway roundabout when there's a pub nearby. And we actually saw on footage Boyle parking his stolen motorbike up by the pub, he said, and then spending some 20 minutes before returning to meet his friend. And in those 20 minutes, he was very close to the area of John Kinsella's home. And again, prosecutors were able to outline, well, this was you scoping out, scouting the area. I mean, we've talked about a lot of the work that was done in the aftermath of the shooting, in the days and weeks after, but even just in the immediate time frame, the police response in the area, the number of sirens that would have been going off, the number of blue lights, the number of officers called to the scene, that may well have played a part in Boyle panicking and deciding to abandon the Renault Clio, because that can't have been part of his original plan.
No, we agree, and that is one of our theories, that's exactly what did happen. As he was fleeing the scene, he panicked. He had taken the gun with him. He knew he was in possession of the gun, and because police were making to the scene, he did panic and abandon the car. And like you said earlier, we tried to say that he'd come back, he'd hidden the car underneath, the gun underneath the driver's seat, and then he'd been back and moved it. We don't believe that for a minute. The car was locked when we attended. In fact, we spent a long time searching for keys, because that was the reason he didn't come back. And we would say the petrol can in the car was there because the intention was to clean themselves down and remove gunshot residue, because they'd been involved in the murder, and that was the purpose. So you're right. Our initial response was a key factor in the recovery of some significant evidence further on. Those people that attended that scene, including members of the public, is horrific for them. And I think probably we lose sight sometimes during the course of the investigation what they saw when they attended. Wendy Owen herself, I have to say, paid tribute to her. I did immediately after the verdicts. She was absolutely fantastic, and she showed real bravery during the course of the hearing to actually support us throughout. And give evidence during the hearing. What you did see was immediately after we'd cleaned the scene, Wendy was desperate to go back and show us what happened. We videoed that with our two family liaison officers, and that was powerful evidence, really, the way that was played out in court. And she talked us through, and that must have been a harrowing experience for her to relive that.
To retrace those footsteps.
And we always felt that was a really, really difficult thing for her to do, and for her to demonstrate that bravery in supporting the investigation in the manner that she did. It was quite unbelievable, really. She is a credit to the family. John was one of 9. He's got 8 sisters. Met them all during the course of the trial. And I think our management of the two families worked well as well. And obviously the results was really, really important for everybody concerned.
This was a meticulous murder carried out by a meticulous man, planned to the nth degree, using disguises. Was Fellows' recruitment of Boyle his downfall? Boyle seemed to panic and go off the plan, and then of course later spectacularly betrayed him in court. Is that where he went wrong in recruiting this henchman?
I think you're right. I think that was the case. I think he was let down. Ultimately, whether he was let down or not by Stephen Boyle, it is for the jury to decide, I suppose, and as they did. But we still would have got to Mark Fellows by investigation, regardless of what happened. Obviously, even before the recovery of the vehicle, we were in a good place around the investigation, and that was just the ice on the cake, really, that we got the car back.
And when Boyle said what he said in court, which must have led to a few raised eyebrows, what was going through your mind? Were you thinking, this is it, we've got him?
We were delighted, of course. I think everybody involved or linked to the investigation was, including the families, both families. It was a significant moment, and we speak to staff that attend court day in, day out. They said that type of thing doesn't happen that regularly.
It's like something from off the TV, isn't it?
It was, and I've been in the police 25 years. I've never seen anything like it, and I was elated as a senior investigating officer. We always believed that was what happened, actually, that he was handed the gun at that location. But for him actually to come out and tell us was a fantastic moment during the course of the trial. And we were really pleased, and we felt then that Mark Fellows was going to have some difficulty with a verdict after that.
Yeah, indeed. I think the evidence, some would say, many would say, and certainly the jury found, was overwhelming against Fellows even before that point. And in reality, all that served to do was to implicate Boyle further in what had happened. A cutthroat defence, as it's known, a cutthroat defence when one defendant turns on the other, 9 times out of 10 doesn't end up working out very well for either defendant. And I think so it proved, because Boyle then found it very difficult to explain, as we've said, a number of points such as the car being left and it being locked or unlocked. He found it very difficult to explain why a partner in crime, a criminal associate of some 20 years, why he suddenly would have sprung a weapon on him when he simply could have asked him if he wanted to be involved in the enterprise. I think it was a moment that certainly in my 13 years of covering court, I've never seen anything quite like it. And it was certainly a pivotal moment in the trial. And the judge referred to it in his sentencing remarks, said that the account given by Boyle was a lie. The story about the Renault Clio being left unlocked for the gun to be collected was a lie. And I think ultimately it probably brought down both men.
I agree. I do. I think it was just totally unbelievable, wasn't it? I think everybody in court felt the same. Really interesting moment. It was. And may never see that again.
Indeed.
One thing that experienced journalists and I think probably police officers rarely see, and which also seems like the stuff of a TV drama, is staring a contract killer in the face. Mark Fellows was literally a contract killer. Have you ever come across someone like that before?
Thankfully, not very often, and hopefully not too often again in the future. We've asked questions about this since. What's it like to deal with that type of person? I think at the time you're too preoccupied gathering the evidence that you need. But certainly, the detectives that interviewed him said that he was cold, and clearly that's the type of thing I'm interested in when we're debriefing the interview processes that are taking place. To do what he did is just unbelievable, and very few people, thankfully, will do that. And I think the sentencing clearly reflected that. The whole life tariff. The first thing we did afterwards was Google it and to see how many other people have been given them. And I think there's only 70 ever that have been given that whole life tariff, and that gives you some indication of the level of planning that went in. He'd committed murder before. He'd committed a second one. And I suppose we were fearful if we didn't catch him, he may go on and do it again. And we would say that was the reason he'd picked Stephen Boyle, because I know he wasn't found guilty of the Paul Massey murder. We felt that he'd go to a trusted confidant, really, to assist him. But no, really, really interesting moment.
As you say, a whole life sentence, as far as I'm aware, that's the first that's ever been handed down at Liverpool Crown Court. They are extremely rare. It's the most severe punishment that can be delivered by a judge for the most serious and exceptionally rare cases. You talk of his cold nature. The court heard of a nickname that was ascribed to him, the Iceman. Just hours before killing Paul Massey, he was in a pub with his family, enjoying a family meal, with one of his children playing with his encrypted PGP BlackBerry phone, on which he made the final arrangements for the killing. After killing John Kinsella, he returned home, went out to the Trafford Centre and bought some shoes, went out for a meal, and then went celebrating, socialising with friends in pubs and clubs. This was a man who was, it seems, entirely at ease with carrying out the most brutal assassinations and then going about his daily life as if nothing had ever happened. And as by his very nature as a contract killer, him being off the streets means that we're all safer, not just people involved in organised crime or people said to have connections to gangs, but to the innocents who can be caught up in these, the girlfriends, the partners, the wives, family and friends, neighbours, gunshots fired at houses we've heard about in this case, bullets passing through windows, through fences, into neighbouring drives and into back gardens. We talked of the people who were caught up in the moment after the John Kinsella murder, workmen who pulled up on the motorway slip road to come to Wendy Owen's aid. All of these people experienced something on those days that will live with them forever. And now all of these communities are a little bit safer with these two men off the streets.
Yes, we're absolutely delighted with the sentence. It really sends a very, very positive message about tackling serious and organised crime. People don't like going to jail. They don't like going to jail forever. And I think that sends a clear message out, and it will discourage others from getting involved, I believe. And talking to others in and around the court that may well be involved, I think felt the same. So
the Iceman veneer seemed to crack when he got the whole life tariff. That perhaps surprised him how long, the rest of his life he was going to serve in prison. What was it like? I mean, you saw his reaction.
Well, it was the first time he'd ever said anything during the proceedings. He stood up and he shouted abuse. He said that he never shot at Wendy Owen and she was a liar. By inference, he was admitting that he'd shot the others and killed them. And I think everybody in the courtroom believed that. And, that was the first reaction we saw from him. We saw him shaking his head occasionally. I think he went bright red when Stephen Boyle was given evidence and he actually, disclosed that he'd handed him the gun. That was a really interesting moment, as we've discussed previously, but it caused some issues from a policing point of view. I think what people forget is through the course of the trial, we've had a 6-week trial. These have been based in Manchester prison, and there's a lot of police work and planning gone into actually transporting them between the prison and the court every day, causing significant disruption to the community and commuters travelling up and down the M62, Edge Lane. I know we've shut lanes and it's been a massive policing operation. And that was a really interesting moment from a security point of view, the fact that they'd been friends, lifelong friends up until that moment, and what that relationship was going to be like when they went back to prison that night.
They're unlikely to be sharing a cell now.
I suggest not.
Absolutely. I mean, you talk about the length of the trial there, all those 26 days of the trial, 27 if you include the sentencing. The family, the victims in the case of the immediate people affected by the incidents, in the case of Wendy Owen, and the family of both John Kinsella and Paul Massey, they sat through all that evidence, all that case. In the case of Massey's family, this is some nearly 4 years now since their loved one was killed. It must mean a lot to you, having supported those families all the way through this journey, and I imagine to have given them a lot of assurances and tried to tell them that everything is being done to bring to justice the people responsible. It must mean a lot to you at the end of all of that for them to be able to look you in the face outside court and say thank you.
Undoubtedly, and I think probably that's where we take our pleasure from. But myself, Carl Jones from Greater Manchester Police, Tom Kelly, Kirsty Miller, my deputy, Richie Jones. That's where we take our pleasure from, and the CPS as well. They worked really, really hard in pulling this case together. If you think back to the murder, particularly around John Kinsella was only on the 5th of May. We went to trial on the 26th of November. There's a lot of work involved in preparing a file, and that's what people don't see. It's the post-charge process is really, really complicated, and we worked hard, really bringing that together in presenting the evidence in the manner in which we did. But like you said, supporting the family through the court process is really, really hard. It's such a drain on everybody involved. And what we didn't do was talk to the families about the evidence in great detail prior to the trial, because what we didn't want was any disclosure to be made to anybody involved. So a lot of the evidence was only heard for the first time. And I suppose from our point of view, my point of view, I know that frustrated the family that I didn't or couldn't talk to them about it earlier on, because clearly there were 2 trials. And what I didn't want was anything that I'd said have an influence on anything that might be taking place in Manchester, and vice versa. The Greater Manchester Police were be careful about what they said to poor Massey's family as well, only because it's a very, very sensitive issue. And, we celebrated last night, as you'd imagine. We were absolutely delighted. And I know the families, when they're thanking us, and they both did, that they've got to start rebuilding their lives now. And hopefully, as of today, they'll start doing that. Poor Wendy Owen, she's the mother of a young child, been born recently. That child's going to grow up without a father. She'll never get over it. I can see that, as will any of his sisters.
How did you celebrate, and who with?
In style. we went for a drink collectively, and members of the family joined us, and members of the prosecution team as well.
That must be very gratifying for members of Paul Massey and John Kinsella's family. Paul Massey and John Kinsella, known members of the criminal underworld, their families, you could expect, would be distrustful of police, that they would be celebrating with you.
That is a rewarding factor of this case, and we spoke about that previously. That I think you've got to be careful, really, the way sometimes families are portrayed in the media. Certainly, I speak more specifically around John Kinsella's case because I'm the senior investigating officer for that. I know the sisters in particular, and Wendy, were quite upset at times by the way that his name was portrayed in the media, and they feel that we sit behind that. So, to answer your original question, I suppose it was really, really satisfying from a family point of view that they felt that we've done our job in bringing 2 extremely dangerous men to justice, and we take great satisfaction from that. One of the things I wanted to talk about today was the fact that it was the first murder investigation that we've led from our operational command centre in Speke, which was the new building we'd invested £50 million in. From a senior investigating officer point of view, that was a key feature, I felt, of this investigation. And the reason I say that is because I had all the key people I needed around me. I had use of new technology, which meant that when we were briefing, not just detectives, search teams, surveillance staff, there was lots of work taking place. They were all at my fingertips, and I wasn't going in asking for people to assist me with bits of requests. They all felt as though they were part of the investigation and working together. And they understood the reasons why. And, post-sentence, I opened my phone up and I had nearly 300 text messages from colleagues across the force who were involved in local policing, response and resolution. Everybody, within Merseyside Police were absolutely delighted that we got the result that we felt we deserved, we'd earned. I go back to the 6th of May, the day after the murder, and it was absolutely baking. And I went to see the crime scene officers at the scene, and it was so hot, and they were sweltering, with the forensic white suits on, and the search teams were the same. And we searched and searched and searched, looking for the gun, looking for the bullets that we said that were discharged against Wendy Owen, looking for all the evidence, really. And people don't always see that side of the the investigation.
The other angles and the other aspects that perhaps you've already managed to discount, that you managed to, you managed to put to one side by doing hard work. You've managed to say, well, this didn't happen. We need to pursue a different line of investigation. That sort of work isn't seen, of course, is it? All the things that you've already ruled out.
No, that's right. You don't, and that's really, really important, though, because what we disproved was that through the CCTV work that the gunman couldn't have come and gone from any of the other routes. Bear in mind, we've got the M62, which meant the traffic up and down there, as you can imagine, is really, really busy, even on a Saturday morning, and even the link road back towards Widnes. That link road there is incredibly busy. We did a lot of work around ANPR activity, and I think 125 cars travelled backwards and forwards up and down that road in the space of 10 minutes. Now, to try and rule that out, and the fact that the gunman had gone another route, it's painstaking detective work, really. To leave a jury with no option than to conclude that he must have been the person responsible. The timings were critical. That came out, didn't it, during the course of the trial? There was lots of disputes around timing. The calibration of CCTV is tricky. It is. And sometimes the longer you leave it to go and collect it, the more difficult it can be to succinct the time back to real time, and overlaying that with movement of phones. And this is a modern investigation, like you've alluded to before, really. We're talking about serious organised crime, and the investigations are complex. Yeah. The ideal scenario for a juror would be that you see the gunman with a gun in his hand, and some witnesses would see it. But John Kinsella was shot dead in the middle of the field, walking his dogs, with only his partner to see that. Nobody else witnessed it. That is tricky. Paul Massey, he'd come back from his holiday away in North Wales. He gets out of his car and shot dead on his driveway. Again, very few witnesses saw what happened, and the route that Mark Fellows took when he fled the scene, really, really difficult for the investigation, really. And he did an amazing job, Greater Manchester Police, in unpicking that, really.
Well, he made it very difficult for you, but you got your man in the end. Well, many congratulations.
Absolutely. All that painstaking work, it certainly reaps its rewards. It sounds like there's a lot of other people you owe a pint. But thank you very much for joining us and giving us such insight on what has been a very troubling series of events, but a fascinating case. And as I say, a great result for both Merseyside Police and Greater Manchester Police.
Lovely. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.